The judge laughed at the old veteran's fake medals until the Admiral entered and saluted him as the general's salute echoed through the room. The entire courtroom remained in stunned silence. No one moved. The judge, once brimming with authority, stood frozen, his mouth agape. The air felt thick, charged with an undeniable tension. General Thompson lowered his hand and turned to the seated veteran, Sergeant Major Martin Kelly. His gaze softened with a mixture of admiration and respect. He then turned back to the rest of the room, his commanding presence filling the space. "Let me tell you who this man is," he began, his voice rich with history. "This is Sergeant Major Martin Kelly, a hero, a legend, and someone none of you should have ever dared to mock." The weight of his words sank into the atmosphere, hanging heavy. The courtroom, once buzzing with judgment and skepticism, now simmered with awe. Even the judge, who had belittled the veteran just moments ago, stood silently, a reflection of his own realization of the truth. The general continued, his voice carrying the full weight of history. "In the freezing hills of Korea, during the brutal winter of 1950, Sergeant Kelly led his platoon through enemy lines when they were ambushed. He didn't retreat. He didn't run. He held his ground, saving the lives of dozens of his men, including his commanding officer. For that, he was awarded the highest honors this country could offer." The words were deliberate, each one landing with the force of a stone being cast into still waters. There was no response from the judge, who stood silently, his head bowed slightly. He could no longer deny the gravity of his mistake. General Thompson's presence alone had forced the truth into the open. He turned back to Martin, his voice softening. "You were a hero then, Sergeant Kelly, and you are a hero now." Martin Kelly, who had remained quiet through it all, finally spoke, his voice raspy but steady. "I don't need these medals to remind me of what I did. I did it because it was the right thing to do." The simplicity of his words cut through the tension in the room. The general nodded, as though in agreement, and addressed the judge directly. "Judge Albright," he said, his voice low but full of authority, "you have disrespected a man who has earned his place in history. I believe an apology is in order, not just to him, but to every man and woman who has ever worn this uniform." The judge, whose earlier bravado had faltered, now stood in complete silence. His face reddened as the truth of his actions weighed heavily on him. He finally cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Sergeant Major Kelly, I apologize for my words. I had no idea who you were." Martin met his gaze, his eyes unwavering. "No harm done, Your Honor. It's not the first time someone's mistaken me for a fool." The general, who had never once wavered in his own composure, now stepped forward. He extended a hand to Martin, helping him to his feet. The two men locked eyes, one a young officer, still in the prime of his career, and the other a weathered veteran, whose very presence seemed to speak of countless battles fought, both on the field and in life. "You've earned more than just this apology, Sergeant Kelly," the general said, his voice thick with respect. "You've earned the right to be honored, and you will be. Today, in front of everyone here, you will be recognized for the hero you truly are." The courtroom, once a place of judgment and mockery, now became a place of reverence. One by one, the people who had been quick to dismiss Martin Kelly stood and gave him a standing ovation. The judge, no longer the man in charge, remained seated, his head bowed in quiet acknowledgement. The weight of his own actions was too much for him to ignore. As the applause filled the room, Martin Kelly turned to the general, his expression one of quiet gratitude. "Thank you, sir. But it was never about the medals. It was always about the men I served with, the ones who never made it home." The general nodded, understanding perfectly. "And they would be proud of you today, Sergeant. Proud of the man you are." With that, the room fell silent again, not out of discomfort, but out of respect, for a man who had fought for something far greater than recognition, for his comrades, for his country, and for the simple but powerful truth that honor cannot be mocked. As the courtroom began to quiet down from the uproarious applause, General Thompson placed a hand on Martin Kelly's shoulder, offering a small but respectful nod. The air in the room was thick with a newfound respect, as the judge, his earlier arrogance replaced with humility, sat back down at his bench, avoiding eye contact with the old veteran. The entire scene was surreal. A courtroom that had been a stage for mockery was now a place of genuine reverence. As the applause faded, The general stepped forward, his voice resonating across the room. Now, I know we've all seen a lot of injustice today, but I assure you, this is not the end of it, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. This man, Sergeant Major Martin Kelly, has been wronged, not just by the judge, but by anyone who's ever doubted the sacrifices of our veterans. And I'm here to set the record straight. The courtroom fell into a deep, respectful silence. The general's words were carefully chosen, each one deliberate, not just to honor Martin, but to teach a lesson to everyone present. What you see in front of you, General Thompson continued, his voice steady, is not just a medal, not just a piece of metal hung on a ribbon. These medals represent the blood, sweat, and tears of men and women who fought to defend this country. They represent sacrifice, bravery, and loyalty, values we can all strive to embody. He turned to Martin, his expression softening. And you, Sergeant Kelly, are the embodiment of those values. It's not just the medals you wear, but the life you've lived and the stories you carry with you. Martin, still sitting in his wheelchair, met the general's gaze. He nodded, his weathered face betraying little emotion, but his eyes spoke volumes, eyes that had witnessed more than most could comprehend. The young public defender, David, stood at the side, still in shock. He had barely managed to comprehend the gravity of the situation. He had believed Martin's story, but now, hearing it from General Thompson himself, the truth was undeniable. This was no ordinary veteran. This was a man who had lived through the most harrowing experiences imaginable. David stepped forward, hesitantly at first, then with more confidence. Your Honor, if I may, he said, his voice steady. I think we can all agree that Sergeant Kelly deserves more than just an apology. The judge, still red-faced but silent, nodded slowly. Yes, I believe we can all agree on that. The general, hearing David's words, nodded in agreement. You're absolutely right. Martin Kelly doesn't just deserve an apology. He deserves the recognition he was denied. And I'm going to make sure he gets it. With a deliberate gesture, the general called to one of his officers, who stepped forward and handed him a small, but significant folder. He opened it, revealing a crisp, official-looking document. Sergeant Major Martin Kelly, the general read aloud, his voice cutting through the silence. In recognition of your outstanding service and the sacrifices you've made for this nation, I hereby present you with a formal commendation from the United States Army. This commendation is not just for your actions during the war, but for your continued dedication to the ideals that make this country great. You have served with honor, and you continue to inspire those around you. As the general handed the document to Martin, the room remained silent. Martin's hands trembled slightly as he took the paper, his eyes scanning the words, his face betraying only a faint smile. It wasn't the recognition he had sought all these years, but it was something that, for the first time in a long while, felt right. Thank you, sir, Martin said quietly, his voice rough. The general placed a firm hand on his shoulder, offering him the kind of respect that only a man who had served could give. It's the least we can do, Martin. Your service means more than any of us can say. The courtroom erupted into applause once again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the kind of applause that came from shock or awe, but from genuine respect. Martin Kelly had earned that respect long ago, but today, the world had finally recognized it. The judge, who had once ridiculed Martin, now stood in silence, his hands folded in front of him, his gaze lowered. For the first time, he understood the weight of what he had done. The general stepped away from the podium, allowing Martin a moment to compose himself. Today, he said to the room, we've witnessed the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Let this be a reminder that our veterans deserve our respect, not just in words, but in actions. Sergeant Major Kelly is a symbol of everything this country stands for, and I am proud to stand by him today. With that, the room fell silent once more, the air thick with the weight of the moment. It was clear that the apology and recognition Martin had received were not just a formality. They were a lesson that would stay with everyone in that room for the rest of their lives. Martin Kelly may have been a quiet, unassuming figure, but today, he had been given the recognition he deserved. And as the applause died down, a sense of peace settled over the room. The general, Martin, and the rest of the courtroom stood in silence, honoring the veteran who had given so much. The man who had been dismissed and humiliated just hours earlier was now standing tall, his dignity restored, his legacy sealed in the hearts of everyone present. As the last round of applause faded away, the courtroom seemed to shift. The mood was different now. The judgment had been made, but the respect for Sergeant Major Martin Kelly had only just begun to settle in. The general, still standing at the front, gave a brief nod to Martin before he turned and motioned for his officers to follow him out. They all made their way to the door, their heavy boots clicking on the floor with a steady rhythm, signaling the end of a chapter. But for Martin, it was just the beginning of a new phase. Outside the courthouse, the bright sunlight hit his face, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, feeling the warmth on his skin. It had been a long time since he had felt so at peace, yet there was still a weight in his heart, a weight he had carried for years. The weight of never being fully recognized, never being fully understood. But today had been different. Today, his story had been heard, and the truth had been revealed. The general, who had once commanded thousands, was now standing beside him, offering him something more valuable than any medal: respect. It was a quiet moment, but it spoke volumes. The general approached him, his steps measured and deliberate. "Martin," he said, his voice still carrying that deep, commanding tone, but softened by the respect he had for the man standing before him. "I need to ask you something." Martin turned toward him, his brow furrowing slightly in curiosity. "What is it, sir?" The general hesitated for a moment, then spoke with the kind of sincerity that Martin had rarely encountered. "I want to know more about your service. Your story. The real story. There's so much that I think people don't understand about the sacrifices you made. I don't think anyone ever took the time to listen." Martin's eyes softened. It wasn't the first time someone had wanted to hear his story, but there was something different about this moment. There was no pity in the general's words, no hidden agenda, just a genuine interest in hearing the truth. "Well," Martin began slowly, his voice rough but steady, "I guess it's time someone knew." As they sat down on a nearby bench, Martin started to speak, his voice carrying the weight of years of silence. He told the general about the early days, the days before he was called to serve, about growing up in the small town where everyone knew everyone's name. He spoke of the bonds he had formed with his fellow soldiers, the ones who had become his family in the trenches of war. He spoke of the moments of fear, of uncertainty, but also of the moments when they had each other's backs, when it didn't matter who you were, where you came from, or what your background was. It was about survival. It was about loyalty. "When we were out there, all we had was each other," Martin continued, his eyes distant as if he were reliving the memories. "We didn't have time to think about medals or awards. We had one job, and that was to bring everyone home." The general listened intently, his expression serious but understanding. He had heard similar stories from others, but hearing it from Martin made it hit differently. It wasn't just a story of heroism. It was a story of sacrifice, of years spent in the shadows, of never expecting anything in return. "And those medals," Martin said quietly, looking down at the ones that had once been mocked in court, "they weren't for me. They were for the men who didn't make it back. They were for the ones who died on that battlefield, the ones who never got the recognition they deserved. I was just lucky enough to come home. So those medals, they're not mine. They belong to them." The general, who had been holding back his own emotions, let out a breath. He understood now. The weight of those medals wasn't just in the medal or the ribbon. It was in the memories, the faces, the names. The real heroes were the ones who didn't come back, the ones who would never be remembered in the same way. Martin had carried that burden for years. He had carried the memory of his fallen comrades, the knowledge that they had never been given the recognition they deserved. The general placed a hand on Martin's shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "I understand now," he said softly. "You've carried more than just those medals. You've carried the weight of an entire generation, an entire war. And you've done it alone." Martin gave him a small, weary smile. "I never did it alone," he replied. "I had my brothers. And I have them still." The general nodded, understanding the depth of those words. They sat in silence for a moment, two men from different generations, united by the shared understanding of sacrifice. Finally, the general spoke again. "I want to make sure your story is told," he said. "I want the world to know what you did, what you sacrificed. Not just for me, not just for them, but for everyone." Martin looked up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. I never wanted fame, Martin said softly. I just wanted to be left in peace. The general smiled. You don't need fame, but you deserve respect. And I think it's time the world gave you that. As the sun began to set over the horizon, the two men stood up, their conversation coming to a close. Martin had shared his story, the general had listened, and in that quiet moment, a new chapter had begun. It wasn't just about the medals anymore. It was about honoring the past and ensuring that the sacrifices of those who came before would never be forgotten. And as they walked together toward the waiting vehicles, there was a sense of peace, knowing that the truth had finally been heard. As Martin Kelly and General Thompson made their way to the waiting vehicle, the energy around them was different. There was no longer the weight of skepticism or judgment that had been present earlier in the courthouse. Instead, there was an air of quiet respect, a recognition that had been long overdue. The general had made it clear to those who had once doubted Martin that today was about more than just a single man's story. It was about honoring the veterans who had been overlooked, forgotten, or misunderstood for far too long. It wasn't just a battle won in the courtroom. It was a battle won for the memory of countless men and women who had served with honor but never received the respect they deserved. As the two men walked side by side, Martin couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, even if fleeting. It had been decades since he had spoken so openly about his past. And yet, even now, the burden of memory seemed to weigh heavily on him. The men he had fought with, the ones who didn't come home, they were still with him. Always. It wasn't something he spoke about often, but it was something that never left him. General Thompson, sensing the quiet turmoil in Martin's demeanor, spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of understanding. You know, Martin, he said, today wasn't just about you. It was about them. The ones who didn't make it back. The ones who never got their due. Martin looked up at him, his expression softening. I never did it for the recognition, he replied quietly. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I did it because I had my brothers by my side, and I wasn't going to leave anyone behind. The general nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. That's the spirit that made you a legend. That's why your story matters. Not just for the recognition, but for what it says about duty, about loyalty, about sacrifice. It's a story that needs to be told, Martin. And I'm going to make sure it is. The words hung in the air between them, resonating with an undeniable truth. As they reached the vehicle, the general paused, turning to face Martin fully. I want you to know something, he said. I'm not just doing this for you. I'm doing this for every veteran who ever felt like they were forgotten. Every soldier, every sailor, every airman who never got the respect they were due. Your story isn't just your own. It's a story for all of them. Martin looked at the general, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had never expected to find himself in this position. After all these years, after everything he had been through, he was finally being recognized for the man he had always been, not the one others had mistaken him for. As the general placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple yet powerful gesture of solidarity, Martin felt a sense of closure he had never thought possible. This was the recognition he had always wanted. Not for himself, but for the brothers he had lost, for the sacrifices they had all made. Thank you, Martin said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for seeing the truth. General Thompson gave him a firm nod. It was always there, Martin. People just needed to open their eyes. As they both climbed into the vehicle, the world outside seemed to shift. The city streets, the bustling crowds, everything felt a little quieter, a little more reverent. The general's commitment to ensuring Martin's story was told wasn't just a personal victory for the veteran. It was a victory for all those who had been silenced by time, by misunderstanding, or by neglect. The truth had finally found its voice, and there was no turning back now. The journey to this moment had been long and difficult, but it was a journey that had led to something greater than recognition. It had led to a restoration of dignity, both for Martin and for all veterans who had been overlooked or forgotten. As the vehicle pulled away from the courthouse, the general looked over at Martin once more, his face set with determination. This is just the beginning, he said quietly. We're going to make sure the world knows what you did. The world will know what true heroism looks like. Martin said nothing, but his heart swelled with a quiet pride. He wasn't doing this for the fame, for the accolades, or even for the medals. He was doing it for the fallen. And that, he knew, was enough. As the vehicle carrying Martin Kelly and General Thompson moved through the quiet streets, there was a sense of finality in the air, yet an unspoken promise lingered. Martin stared out the window, watching the world pass by, his mind still reeling from everything that had transpired. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, he had been mocked in that courtroom, dismissed as just another old man with medals that didn't matter. And now, thanks to the general, he was leaving that same room as a legend, not just in the eyes of the military, but in the eyes of the world. The general, however, was already focused on the future, already planning what needed to be done next. "Martin," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I've been thinking about how we can share your story. It's more than just a courtroom apology. It's about giving you the recognition you've earned, and that starts now." Martin turned to look at him, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean, sir? I'm not just going to stop here," the general replied firmly. "I've already made arrangements. We're going to put together a memorial, something that honors your service and the service of all veterans who never got their due. It's time the world knows what true heroism really is." Martin felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, this kind of acknowledgement. For so long, his service had been about the men he had fought with, the ones who had made the ultimate sacrifice. It had never been about him. "I don't need a memorial," Martin said quietly. "I don't need anything." The general shook his head, his face hardening with resolve. "No, Martin, you do. You deserve this. And so do the men who never came home. You've carried their memory for so long. Now, it's time for the world to carry it with you." The words hit Martin harder than he expected. It was strange, almost uncomfortable, to think about receiving anything for the work he had done decades ago. But as he looked at the general, he realized there was more to this than just personal recognition. The memorial wasn't for him. It was for the soldiers who had fallen, for the ones whose stories had never been told. As the car drove through the streets, the city felt a little quieter, more reflective. The general was right. This wasn't just about Martin. It was about every veteran who had never been given the honor they deserved. Martin's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden stop of the vehicle. He looked up to see that they had arrived at the base. As they stepped out, a few officers were already waiting for them. The general walked beside Martin, his presence commanding respect, and they headed inside. The command center was busy, filled with officers preparing for the next phase of operations. But as soon as they saw Martin, everything stopped. Officers who had been immersed in their work stood and saluted him. The respect was palpable, and it was clear that the general's words had carried weight. It wasn't just about the memorial anymore. It was about creating a movement, a ripple effect that would honor veterans everywhere. The general led Martin into a meeting room, where he was introduced to a group of key personnel who had been brought together to help make the memorial a reality. As the meeting began, Martin listened, still processing everything. The officers discussed plans for the ceremony, the logistics, and how best to make sure that the story of his service and the service of others like him would be told in the most meaningful way possible. As the discussions continued, Martin's mind began to drift back to the battlefield, to the faces of his fallen comrades. He could hear their voices, their laughter, their cries in the night. He could see their faces in his mind as clear as if it had all just happened yesterday. It was never about him. It was about them. And that's why he had kept going all these years, carrying their memory. After the meeting, the general pulled him aside. "Martin," he said softly, "you don't have to do this. But I want you to know that your story is going to help a lot of people. There are veterans out there who are still waiting to be seen. And now, because of you, they will be." Martin nodded, the weight of those words sinking in. The world was changing, and maybe, just maybe, his story could make a difference. "I never thought I'd be the one to stand in front of a room full of people like this," Martin said, his voice thick with emotion. "But if it helps others, if it helps them find the peace that I've been searching for all these years, then maybe it's worth it." The general smiled, a rare moment of softness breaking through his usually stoic demeanor. "That's why your story matters, Martin. It's not just about you. It's about showing the world what real courage looks like." As they left the room, Martin felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the memorial or the recognition. It was about the veterans who had never been acknowledged, the ones who were still waiting for their stories to be told. And for the first time in a long while, Martin believed that his story, our story, was finally going to be heard. The days following the meeting at the command center were a whirlwind of activity for Martin Kelly. The general's words had ignited a spark in him, a spark he hadn't felt in years. As the planning for the memorial continued, it became clear that this wasn't going to be just a small ceremony. This was going to be a movement that would honor not just Martin, but all the veterans who had gone unnoticed for too long. The media was brought in, interviews were scheduled, and veterans from all over the country were invited to share their stories. For the first time in a long time, Martin felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. The memorial wasn't just about a place or a stone. It was about preserving the stories of those who had sacrificed so much. As the day of the ceremony approached, the city buzzed with anticipation. The venue was set, a large, open park where military families and veterans could gather to honor those who had served. Flags were raised, and the ground was prepared for the ceremony. But for Martin, the weight of the moment was more than he had ever expected. He wasn't just walking into a room of strangers anymore. He was walking into a community, a family of people who understood him, who understood the sacrifices he had made and the ones he had witnessed. On the day of the memorial, the weather was perfect, a clear blue sky and a gentle breeze that seemed to whisper through the trees. The crowds gathered early, and by noon, the park was filled with veterans, families, and media crews. Martin stood near the stage, watching the people around him, his heart racing. This was the moment he had never thought would come, but here it was. He wasn't sure what to expect. There had been so many years of feeling forgotten, of living in the shadow of his past. But now, as the crowd gathered and the ceremony began, it was clear that this was his time to stand tall and proud. General Thompson took the stage first, his commanding presence immediately quieting the crowd. He spoke briefly but powerfully, acknowledging the sacrifices of all veterans, but especially Martin's. Today, we are not just honoring one man, the general said, his voice carrying through the microphone. We are honoring an entire generation of heroes who have gone unrecognized for far too long. We are here to ensure that their sacrifices are not forgotten, that their stories live on, and that we as a nation will never fail to honor them. The crowd erupted into applause, but it was nothing compared to the silence that followed as the general introduced Martin. The old veteran, once mocked and dismissed, now stood before a sea of people who were all there to honor him. He had never been the type to seek the spotlight, but in that moment, he felt something shift. He was no longer the forgotten soldier. He was the man who had carried the weight of history on his shoulders, and today, that history was finally being recognized. As Martin approached the microphone, he felt a wave of emotions wash over him. He had seen so much, lost so much, and yet he had survived. And now, standing before a crowd of thousands, he realized how much had changed. The years of carrying the weight of his fallen comrades, the memories of battle, all of it, suddenly felt lighter. "Thank you," Martin began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you to the general, to the veterans here today, and to the families who have supported us. I never asked for recognition. I never asked for a memorial. But I do ask that we never forget the ones who didn't come home. The men I fought with, the ones who made the ultimate sacrifice, they are the real heroes. And I carry their memory with me every day." The crowd stood in absolute silence, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't just the medals, the accolades, or the recognition that mattered. It was the lives of the men and women who had been forgotten, the ones who had fought and died, and who deserved to have their stories told. Martin paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've spent a lot of years trying to forget," he continued, his voice rough, "trying to push away the memories of the war. But the truth is, you can't forget. You can't forget the brothers you lost. You can't forget the promises you made. And you can't forget that this country, this great country, owes them more than we'll ever be able to give." A single tear slid down his weathered cheek, but he wiped it away quickly, unwilling to let it define the moment. The applause that followed was deafening. It wasn't just for him. It was for every veteran in the crowd, for every person who had ever served and never been thanked. The ceremony lasted for hours, with speeches, tributes, and stories shared. But for Martin, the most powerful moment came when he saw the faces of his fellow veterans. Men and women who had been through the same struggles, who had fought the same battles, and who now stood beside him, their heads held high. The weight of history had been lifted, if only for a moment. As the ceremony came to a close, the general turned to Martin, a quiet smile on his face. "You did it, Martin," he said softly. "You gave them what they deserved. You gave them the honor they've been waiting for." Martin nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. It wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. There would be more stories to tell, more veterans to honor. But for now, Martin Kelly had done what he set out to do. He had made sure that the world knew their stories. And that was enough. The days following the memorial were a whirlwind of activity for Martin Kelly. The ceremony had brought his story to the world, but what followed was even more profound. The phone calls, the interviews, the requests for his presence at various events, it all became overwhelming. Yet, through it all, Martin found himself more at peace than he had ever been. The stories of his brothers, the ones who had fought and died alongside him, were finally being shared. His own role in those battles was now being understood, and more importantly, it was being honored. General Thompson had kept his promise. The memorial was only the beginning. Now, the movement to honor veterans, especially those who had been overlooked, was growing. The media buzzed with interviews and stories about the forgotten heroes, and people across the country began to pay closer attention to the sacrifices that had been made. Martin, however, was still adjusting to his newfound role as a public figure. He had spent so many years trying to fade into the background, trying to live a quiet life. But now, his story was out there, and it couldn't be ignored. As Martin sat in his small home, the phone rang once more. He picked it up, expecting another interview request or a call from the media. But this time, it was different. The voice on the other end was familiar, one he hadn't heard in years. "Martin," the voice said, low and steady. "It's Tom." Martin's heart skipped a beat. Tom was one of the men he had fought with in Vietnam. They hadn't spoken in over 40 years, not since that fateful day when Tom had been injured and sent home. Martin had carried the memory of that day, the memory of watching Tom get hit, knowing there was nothing he could do to save him. "Tom," Martin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to hear from you." "I know," Tom replied. "I didn't expect to call, but I've been watching everything that's been happening. The memorial, the stories. You're making a difference, Martin. You're finally getting the recognition you deserve. And I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you." Martin was silent for a moment, the weight of Tom's words sinking in. They had both lived through so much, and now, after all these years, Tom was telling him he was proud. "I didn't do it for the recognition," Martin finally said, his voice thick. "I did it for them. The ones who didn't come back. The ones who never got the chance to tell their stories." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Tom spoke again, his voice was strained. "I know," he said softly. "I've been carrying that same burden for years. I should have called sooner. I should have been there. But I wasn't. And I'm sorry." Martin could feel the weight of Tom's guilt through the phone. They both knew the reality of war, the loss, the pain, the things that couldn't be undone. But in this moment, there was no need for apologies. They had both done their duty. "It's never too late," Martin said, finally letting the weight of those years lift a little. "We're here now, and that's what matters." "You're right," Tom agreed, his voice breaking slightly. "I just wanted you to know that, whatever happens, you've made a difference. You've given a voice to all of us. The ones who were lost, the ones who are still out there." Martin felt a lump in his throat. It was a conversation he never thought he would have, and yet here it was. 40 years of silence, of guilt, of unspoken words, finally being shared. And in that moment, Martin realized something. He had always carried the weight of his fallen brothers with him. But now, it wasn't just a burden, it was a legacy that needed to be passed on, shared with the world. "I'm not the only one," Martin said, his voice steady now. "There are so many others like us, Tom. So many stories left untold. And we owe it to them to keep telling them, to keep their memory alive." Tom was quiet for a moment, and then he replied, his voice filled with resolve. "I'll help you. Whatever it takes. We'll keep their memory alive." Over the next few weeks, Martin and Tom reconnected, sharing their stories, their memories of the men they had fought beside. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the pain of those memories felt almost too much to bear. But as they spoke, as they shared their experiences, something incredible happened. They found healing, not just for themselves, but for the others who had been left behind. Martin's phone never stopped ringing. Media outlets wanted his time, veterans groups sought his counsel, and the nation began to recognize the sacrifices made by soldiers like Martin. But through it all, he never lost sight of why he had started this journey. It wasn't for the fame, the recognition, or the accolades. It was for the men who had served and never been remembered. It was for the veterans who had been forgotten. And as the movement grew, as the stories of other veterans came to light, Martin felt a sense of pride he had never known before. This wasn't just his story. It was the story of every man and woman who had ever worn the uniform. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The momentum continued to build after Martin Kelly's memorial, the attention on veterans growing more intense with each passing day. Stories of forgotten heroes filled the media, and Martin's story was now a symbol of hope for those who had spent years in the shadows. The interviews kept coming, but the focus remained clear. This was about honoring the ones who had been forgotten, those who had never received the recognition they deserved. Martin, however, had never imagined that his journey would lead him here. He had spent so many years in isolation, living a quiet life, far from the glory he never sought. But now, surrounded by a whirlwind of attention, he found himself in the spotlight, a place he never wanted to be. Yet, as the days passed, he began to see something that made it all worth it. Veterans from all over the country reached out to him, some through letters, others by phone, and a few even by email. Their stories were similar to his own. Men and women who had fought for their country, yet were ignored when they returned home. Some had been denied health care, others had been dismissed by society, and many had simply fallen through the cracks. Each message Martin received weighed heavily on him, but it also solidified his purpose. He wasn't just fighting for recognition anymore. He was fighting for the dignity of his fellow veterans. One day, as Martin sat at his kitchen table, reading yet another letter from a fellow veteran, his phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something told him to answer. "Hello," he said, his voice still a bit hoarse from the months of speaking publicly. "Mr. Kelly, it's Colonel Hayes," the voice on the other end said. Martin straightened in his chair. Colonel Hayes had been with him in Vietnam. They had served in the same unit, though they hadn't spoken in decades. "Colonel," Martin replied, his voice full of respect. "I didn't expect to hear from you." "I know it's been a long time," Hayes said, his tone warm but serious. "But I've been following everything that's been happening. The memorial, the stories, the movement you've sparked. It's time we did something bigger, Martin. It's time we give those stories the attention they deserve." Martin felt a surge of emotion as he realized what Hayes was saying. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we take this nationwide," Hayes said firmly. "We've got to organize, to make sure the voices of every veteran who's been silenced are heard. I've been in touch with some of the right people, and I think we can make this happen. It's not just about a memorial anymore. It's about creating a foundation, a platform where veterans can tell their stories, where they can be heard, and where they can finally receive the respect they've earned." Martin was silent for a moment, letting the enormity of Hayes' words sink in. It wasn't just an idea, it was a plan, a mission that could change the way veterans were viewed in America. "I'm with you, Colonel," Martin said finally, his voice steady and full of resolve. "Let's make sure their voices are heard. Let's make sure they're never forgotten again." The conversation continued as the two men began to plan what would become the Veterans Legacy Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to honoring veterans, providing them with resources, and ensuring their stories were shared for generations to come. Over the next few months, they rallied support from fellow veterans, community leaders, and politicians who shared their vision. They worked tirelessly, planning events, creating a website, and reaching out to other veterans organizations. The momentum was undeniable, and the movement began to take shape. Meanwhile, Martin's own life continued to evolve. He was invited to speak at events, to share his story, and to inspire others to take action. But no matter how many times he was recognized, he never lost sight of why he had started this journey in the first place. It was for the fallen. It was for those who had never had the chance to tell their story. And now, with the foundation taking off, Martin felt like he was part of something bigger, something that would continue long after he was gone. The Veterans Legacy Foundation officially launched with a national press event, and soon after, it began to gain traction. Media outlets began to cover the foundation's work, and veterans from across the country shared their stories on the foundation's platform. The stories of men and women who had served, who had fought, who had given so much, began to resonate with the American public. Martin watched as the movement gained more and more support. It wasn't just about the veterans. It was about the American people realizing that these men and women had been forgotten for far too long. They were being given the opportunity to share their experiences, their sacrifices, and their triumphs. As the foundation grew, Martin found himself in a place he never thought possible, leading a movement that was changing the way the nation viewed its veterans. He had gone from being the forgotten soldier to being the one leading the charge to ensure no veteran would ever be forgotten again. The work was far from over, but Martin had found a sense of peace he had never known before. He was no longer carrying the weight of his fallen comrades alone. Now, he was part of a community that understood him, that honored him, and that respected him for the sacrifices he had made. The mission had only just begun, but Martin Kelly knew that the stories of those who had served, those who had sacrificed, would never be forgotten again. Months passed since the launch of the Veterans Legacy Foundation, and Martin Kelly found himself standing at the forefront of a movement that had grown beyond his expectations. It wasn't just about sharing stories anymore. It was about transforming the way the nation saw its veterans, acknowledging their sacrifices in a way that was long overdue. The foundation had become a beacon of hope for countless veterans who had spent years in silence, their stories untold. As Martin continued to travel across the country, attending events and speaking to groups, he saw firsthand the impact this movement was having. Veterans, once isolated and forgotten, were coming together, finding strength in each other's stories. It was as if a floodgate had opened, and the voices of those who had been silenced for so long were finally being heard. One evening, after a particularly emotional speech in a small town, Martin sat alone in his hotel room, reflecting on the journey that had led him here. He thought back to the courtroom, to the moment when he had first stood before the judge, and to the words that had changed everything. That single moment had ignited something bigger than he had ever imagined. Now, with the foundation's success, he knew that the work was just beginning. But it was a heavy burden, one that he could feel weighing on him. The responsibility to ensure that the voices of veterans continued to be heard was something he took seriously. He had made a promise to his fallen comrades, and it was a promise he intended to keep. As Martin sat in silence, the phone rang, breaking his reverie. It was a familiar number, Colonel Hayes. "Martin," Hayes said, his voice warm but filled with urgency. "We need to talk. I've got something big on the horizon, and I want you to be a part of it." Martin sat up straighter, curiosity piqued. "What's going on, Colonel?" "It's time to take this national," Hayes replied. "We've been building momentum on a local level, but it's time to get Washington's attention. We're planning a National Veterans Summit, and I want you to speak at it. It's time for us to show them exactly who we are and what we've done. We've been overlooked for too long, and this summit is our chance to demand the recognition we deserve." Martin's heart skipped a beat. A national summit? It was the kind of opportunity he had always dreamed of, but never thought possible. The thought of standing before the nation, representing every veteran who had ever been overlooked, was both exhilarating and intimidating. "I don't know if I'm the right person for something like that," Martin admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent most of my life keeping my head down, not looking for recognition. But if this is what it takes to get our voices heard, then I'll do it." Hayes paused for a moment, as if weighing Martin's words carefully. "You've already done more than most of us could ever dream of, Martin. You've given a voice to veterans across this country. Now it's time for us to take that voice to Washington. You've earned the right to speak for us all." The words struck Martin deeply. He had never thought of himself as a leader, but now he was being called to lead. He knew that this summit would be a defining moment, not just for him, but for all veterans who had been denied the recognition they deserved. "I'll do it," Martin said, his voice steady with resolve. "Let's make sure they hear us loud and clear." The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. The Veterans Legacy Foundation worked tirelessly to organize the summit, reaching out to veterans groups, organizations, and politicians. The summit was scheduled to take place in Washington, D.C., and the anticipation was palpable. As the day approached, Martin's nerves grew. The magnitude of what they were about to do hit him more with each passing moment. This wasn't just a rally or a protest. It was a moment to stand together, to demand respect, and to show the nation that veterans were a force to be reckoned with. On the day of the summit, the crowd gathered in the heart of Washington, D.C. The streets were filled with veterans, families, and supporters. As Martin stood at the front of the stage, Looking out at the sea of faces, he felt a wave of emotion flood over him. These were the men and women he had fought beside, the ones who had served in silence, the ones who had never been given the respect they were due. And now, together, they were about to make their voices heard. The general took the stage first, his presence commanding the crowd's attention. He spoke of the sacrifices of veterans, the debt that the nation owed them, and the importance of recognizing their contributions to the country. The crowd cheered, but the real moment came when Martin took the stage. He stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. "We've all been there," he began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "We've all been the ones who were overlooked, the ones who were dismissed. We've all carried the weight of our brothers and sisters who didn't come home. But today, we stand together. Today, we're demanding the recognition we deserve, not just for us, but for every man and woman who has ever served this country." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time, Martin felt a deep sense of pride in what they were accomplishing. The summit wasn't just about speeches, it was about change. It was about ensuring that the voices of veterans would no longer be ignored. The momentum continued to build, and as the summit concluded, Martin knew that their work had just begun. The fight for recognition was far from over, but they had taken a giant step forward. Together, they had shown Washington and the rest of the world that veterans were not to be forgotten. They were not invisible, and their stories, their sacrifices, would be heard. The National Veterans Summit had been a resounding success. As the dust settled and the media coverage subsided, Martin Kelly found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The Veterans Legacy Foundation had grown beyond anything he had ever imagined, and the recognition for veterans, particularly those like him who had long been forgotten, had reached new heights. Yet, despite all the praise and the spotlight now shining on the foundation, Martin knew that there was still work to be done. He wasn't content with just this victory. It was only one part of a much larger mission. The veterans who had gathered at the summit, their stories now broadcast to the world, were only the beginning. There were still so many others who had served and never been acknowledged, so many families who had lost loved ones in silence. And Martin, who had carried the weight of his brother's sacrifices for decades, wasn't going to stop until they were all recognized. The phone calls came in regularly now, from politicians, journalists, and veterans organizations. The foundation had caught the attention of Washington in a way that Martin had never anticipated. Invitations to speak at more events rolled in, and doors that had once been closed to veterans began to open. Yet, as the accolades and invitations grew, Martin remained grounded. The attention was never what he had wanted. It had always been about something more. It had always been about the men who had fought beside him, the ones who had fallen, and the promise he had made to them to keep their memory alive. Weeks after the summit, Martin received another call, this time from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. "Mr. Kelly," the voice on the other end of the line said, "we've been following your work closely, and I must say, what you've done for veterans has been incredible. Your foundation has created a movement, and we want to work with you." Martin listened as the secretary outlined a new initiative, a national program designed to provide more comprehensive support to veterans, focusing on mental health, job placement, and healthcare. They wanted Martin to be a part of it, to help shape the future of how veterans were treated in the United States. "We believe that with your leadership and the momentum you've built, we can create lasting change," the secretary continued. Martin sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the offer sinking in. It wasn't just about a program or a title. It was an opportunity to truly reshape the system, to ensure that veterans were cared for long after they had left active duty. "I'm honored, sir," Martin said finally. "But this is bigger than just one program. We need a comprehensive change. A system that doesn't just acknowledge our veterans when it's convenient, but one that honors them every day, before, during, and after service." The secretary's voice was filled with determination. "That's exactly what we're aiming for, Mr. Kelly. We need someone who understands the struggles our veterans face, someone who can speak from experience and push for the changes that are long overdue." After a long discussion, they agreed on a plan to bring together a coalition of veterans, active duty service members, and advocates to shape the new initiative. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But for the first time in years, Martin felt like the system, the one that had long ignored the voices of veterans, was ready to listen. In the months that followed, Martin worked alongside the Department of Veterans Affairs, bringing his first-hand experience and the stories of countless veterans to the table. It was a slow process, but the changes were tangible. Veterans who had once struggled to access healthcare found new pathways for support. Programs were developed to help them transition back to civilian life, offering everything from job placement to mental health services. The initiative was gaining traction, and with each new veteran helped, Martin felt a deeper sense of fulfillment. But despite the progress, there were still moments of doubt. The weight of the responsibility often felt overwhelming. Would these changes be enough? Would they truly make a difference for the veterans who still felt lost, unseen? One evening, as Martin sat alone in his office, reflecting on the progress they had made, the phone rang again. It was a call that he didn't expect, but one that would once again change the course of his journey. "Martin," the voice on the other end said, "it's Tom." It had been a long time since Martin had heard from his old friend, Tom. The two had served together in Vietnam, but they had lost touch over the years. Tom's voice was strained, but there was something in it that made Martin sit up straight. "Tom, is everything okay?" Martin asked, concern creeping into his voice. "I've been following everything you've been doing," Tom said. "And I just wanted to say, you've made a real difference. I didn't realize how much this would change things, not just for you, but for all of us." Martin paused, surprised by the emotion in his friend's voice. "You're part of this too, Tom," Martin said quietly. "You always have been." Tom didn't respond at first, but Martin could hear the crack in his voice. "I know," Tom finally said. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of you. I've been carrying the weight of everything for so long, but seeing what you've done, seeing how many veterans you've helped, it's made me realize that I'm not alone." Martin felt a lump form in his throat. "We've always been in this together, Tom," he replied. "Always will be." And in that moment, Martin realized that the work he had started, the journey he had undertaken, wasn't just about helping veterans. It was about healing, about finding a way to help each other carry the weight of the past and move forward together. As Martin Kelly continued to work alongside the Department of Veterans Affairs, the impact of the National Veterans Initiative began to be felt across the country. It wasn't a quick process, but the changes were tangible. Veterans who had spent years struggling with the bureaucracy of the system were now finding new avenues for support. From healthcare access to mental health resources, the efforts were slowly but surely making a difference. And with every life touched, Martin felt a deeper sense of fulfillment. But it wasn't just the veterans who were benefiting. The public's perception of veterans was shifting. The media, once indifferent to their struggles, was now giving them a platform. Stories that had once been buried in the shadows were now front and center. As Martin sat in his office late one evening, reflecting on how far the movement had come, his phone rang again. This time, it was a call he hadn't expected. "Martin," the voice on the other end said, "it's Colonel Hayes. We need to talk." Martin sat up straighter, a bit surprised by the urgency in his friend's voice. "What's going on, Colonel?" "It's the next step," Hayes replied. "I've been working with some lawmakers, and we think it's time to take this even further. We want to push for a veterans bill, a piece of legislation that will make sure these changes are permanent, that veterans' benefits are protected for generations to come." Martin felt a surge of excitement mixed with nervousness. A bill? That was the kind of long-term change he had been hoping for, the kind of impact that could ensure veterans were never left behind again. "That's incredible," Martin said, his voice steady with determination. "But how do we make sure it gets passed?" Hayes sighed, the weight of the task ahead clear in his tone. "We've got to rally the country. We need to build more momentum, get more veterans and their families involved. We're going to need a massive movement, one that makes it clear this isn't a political issue, it's a human issue. Veterans need to be treated with the respect they deserve, and we're going to make sure they are." Martin's mind raced as he thought about the next steps. This wasn't just about creating a memorial or a program anymore. This was about securing lasting change, making sure veterans' sacrifices would be honored for years to come. "How do we start?" Martin asked, his voice filled with resolve. "We start by telling their stories, just like we have been. We bring the stories of the forgotten heroes to Washington, to the people who have the power to change the system. We make sure every senator, every congressman, every lawmaker knows the truth. And we'll do it together," Martin added, more to himself than to Hayes. "We'll make sure no veteran is left behind." Over the next few months, Martin, Hayes, and the rest of the team behind the Veterans Legacy Foundation worked tirelessly to rally support for the bill. They reached out to veterans groups, organized rallies, and flooded social media with the stories of those who had been ignored for too long. The movement grew, and as more and more veterans spoke out, it became clear that they weren't just advocating for themselves. They were advocating for every person who had ever served. The pressure on lawmakers began to build. Veterans, along with their families, made phone calls, wrote letters, and showed up at town halls. The movement was undeniable, and Washington couldn't ignore it. Finally, after months of effort, the day came. Martin stood in front of a packed room in Washington, D.C., alongside Colonel Hayes and other veterans who had joined the fight. The bill they had worked so hard for was about to be introduced to the Senate. The moment was bittersweet for Martin. He was proud of what they had accomplished, but he knew that the work wasn't done. This was just the beginning of another long battle. But standing there, surrounded by his brothers and sisters in arms, Martin felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in years. They were no longer invisible. They were no longer the forgotten heroes of history. They were a force to be reckoned with. "This is our time," Martin said, his voice loud and clear. "We've fought for this country, we've sacrificed for this country, and now it's time this country gave us the respect we deserve." The room erupted in applause. It wasn't the end of the journey, it was just the next step. And Martin Kelly, the quiet man who had once been overlooked and dismissed, was leading the charge to ensure that every veteran, every fallen soldier, would be remembered and honored for generations to come. The day the bill passed in the Senate was a moment of triumph. But for Martin Kelly, it was the culmination of a lifetime of struggle, sacrifice, and commitment to a cause much bigger than himself. As he stood in front of the Capitol, watching the news reports roll in, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude and peace. The work wasn't finished, but the foundation had been laid. The world had finally recognized what veterans like him had known all along, that their sacrifices had not been in vain, that their stories mattered, and that they deserved to be honored. The foundation had helped countless veterans, but Martin knew there was still more to be done. The bill was just the beginning. It was now up to the country, the nation as a whole, to live up to the promises made. No longer would veterans be invisible. No longer would their sacrifices go unrecognized. The journey had transformed Martin into a leader, someone who had never sought the spotlight, but had found himself standing at the center of a movement that would shape the future for all veterans. And as he sat down with his fellow veterans, talking about the road ahead, he realized that they were all united in their mission. "We've come a long way," Martin said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But the fight isn't over. We've made progress, but there are still veterans out there who are struggling, still families who are living with the pain of losing loved ones in silence. We've got to keep going. We've got to keep pushing for change." His words were met with nods of agreement. His fellow veterans, the ones who had stood by his side through thick and thin, understood the weight of what he was saying. The victories they had achieved weren't just for themselves. They were for all the men and women who had served, for those who had fallen, and for the ones still fighting battles they couldn't talk about. As the months went by, Martin found himself more involved in policy discussions, helping to shape the future of veteran services. He worked closely with lawmakers, speaking to them not just as a veteran, but as someone who had lived through the system's failures and seen firsthand the impact it had on those who were forgotten. The foundation continued to grow, reaching more veterans, providing them with the resources they needed, and ensuring that their voices were heard. Martin had created something that would last long after he was gone. It wasn't about the medals or the ceremonies. It was about the people who had sacrificed so much and never asked for anything in return. And in that sense, Martin's mission was a success. He had made sure the world knew who they were. On the anniversary of the bill's passage, Martin stood at the newly unveiled Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. The crowd was massive, filled with veterans, families, and supporters. The moment was bittersweet for Martin. He stood before the monument, the granite etched with the names of the fallen, and he felt the weight of all those who had been lost. The memorial wasn't just a tribute to the veterans who had died. It was a tribute to every person who had ever served, to every person who had sacrificed, to every person who had fought for something greater than themselves. As he placed a hand on the monument, Martin felt a quiet satisfaction. The foundation was strong, The bill had passed, and the country was starting to change. But it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever served. He looked around at the crowd, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged. The sacrifices he had made, the battles he had fought, both on the field and for recognition, had been worth it. He had helped ensure that the stories of veterans would never be forgotten. And as he turned to walk away, side by side with his fellow veterans, Martin knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for recognition, for respect, for the future of veterans, would continue. But he had started something that could never be undone. He had given his brothers and sisters in arms the respect they had always deserved, and that was something that no one could ever take away. This emotional story follows the journey of a forgotten veteran, Martin Kelly, who spent decades fighting for recognition for himself and his fellow service members. Through hardships, challenges, and personal sacrifices, Martin's journey unfolds as he rises from being dismissed and overlooked to becoming the voice of an entire generation of veterans. In this emotional story, Martin is given the opportunity to share his truth, as the country finally begins to recognize the struggles of those who served. From the initial mocking in a courtroom to standing before the nation at a memorial, Martin's emotional story touches the hearts of all who hear it. His story evolves into a powerful emotional story about the sacrifices made by military personnel, not just on the battlefield, but in everyday life as well. This emotional story highlights the importance of honoring our veterans, ensuring that their sacrifices are not forgotten, and that their voices are heard. The emotional story continues as the Veterans Legacy Foundation is established, ensuring that no veteran ever again feels invisible or unappreciated. This emotional story is one of redemption, legacy, and the collective power of a nation coming together to acknowledge its true heroes.